Hi, welcome to your first class lecture for American Literature. Before we begin the lecture, first, I would like to ask if you have completed the introductory assignments. Before listening to this lecture, you should have read the Colonial Period Introduction Reading Assignment, and you should have completed the note-taking assignment that goes along with that reading. After you completed those two things, you should have gone on and completed the introductory discussion assignment. If you haven't completed those three things, please stop this recording, go back to Blackboard, complete those assignments, and then come back to the class lecture. If you have completed the class lecture, we'll move on. All right, so we're going to start with the colonial period, but even though I know your reading started with the Native Americans and it talked a little bit about Roanoke and the Jamestown settlement, for our purposes, the colonial period is going to begin with the Puritans. So you've got a little bit of background about them already, but we need to talk about a few more things related to their influence on American literature. As you know from your reading, the Puritans wanted to separate themselves from the Church of England. They wanted to purify the Church of England. They wanted to bring the church back to its strict biblical roots. And when people in the church would not bend to their desires, they decided to separate themselves from the Church of England. Part of that reason was because they were so persecuted for their strict beliefs. Because of the persecution they faced, they did go off to Holland for several years, where they did find some measure of religious freedom. But when they heard about the opportunities in the New World, they seized them. They decided to go to the New World for religious freedom and opportunity. Religious freedom, again, is the main reason that the Puritans sought life in a new world. And you'll see from the little graphic here that the Puritans left Plymouth, England, and landed in Massachusetts. They named this place Plymouth Rock after the port that they left from in England. This was not their original destination, though. They wanted to be further south near the Jamestown settlement because the climate was milder, the ground more fertile and such. But of course, we know that they did not land. They got off track and they didn't land where they had originally intended. Even though people came here to the New World in search of religious freedom and new opportunities, it's important to know that the Puritans and the other settlers remained loyal to the British Crown. They considered themselves British citizens, and they looked to Britain for protection and for trade. It's also important to note that the Puritans were well-educated people at a time when not many people were well-educated, not many people in their station of life. But they believed that education would bring them closer to God. They believed that through education they could understand God's will for their lives, and they could become more successful. And with success, they got closer to God. They kind of equated the two things. So let's talk about literature itself. You may have heard the rhetorical question before. Does literature imitate life, or does life imitate literature? And we could discuss that question all semester long. But let's think about it. Why do we preserve literature? Why do we preserve writing? And of course, you know, literature includes a whole lot of things. But do we preserve literature for its historical value? Do we preserve literature for worship, for instruction, reflection? What about entertainment? If you believe we preserve literature for all of these reasons, you would be correct. Except for the Puritans. There was one of these reasons that they did not embrace. Can you guess what it is? Yes, it's entertainment. They did not believe in entertainment. They did not write for entertainment. They would not have embraced the fictional novels or the screenplays of our time. They would have considered those to be vain and ungodly. But they did believe in preserving history. They believed in writing as a form of worship, instruction, and reflection. Now, the Puritan writing is often categorized as Puritan plain style. And there are several characteristics of this Puritan plain style that you're expected to know. Puritans believed that writing should glorify God. They believe that writing should be clear, concise, and useful. They believe that writing should edify or uplift a person or a group, that it should be instructive, it should help people to understand things better. They also believe that writing should be clear in the sense that it should be written in everyday language using simple words, common words. And they often used references to everyday objects in their writing to make what they have had to say more clear for the reader. Now, types of colonial literature are often categorized as historical documents, diaries and journals, letters, reports, sermons, and poetry. Bradford's account of the trip on the Mayflower and then their years here at Plymouth Rock, those early years, we consider that one of our most valuable historical accounts of our history. There were other writers who wrote diaries and journals that are also part of our body of literature. We won't look at very many of those. There are letters, though, and reports back to people in England. All of those are very important parts of American literature. But we're going to look at the historical accounts. We will also look at a sermon, which is a very prevalent form of literature back in the Puritan time, as well as poetry. And poetry was not meant to entertain back then. It was meant as a form of worship and even as a form of instruction in some cases. So these are the types of literature that were important during the colonial period. And for our purposes, we're going to look at historical accounts, sermons, and poetry. All right, finally, one of the last things I want to discuss with you is that the Puritans valued faith above everything else. The idea that faith is more important than reason is prevalent in everything that they did, all of their writing, all of their beliefs. Faith over reason. You need to commit that to memory. Faith over reason. And we'll revisit this idea again and again as we progress through American literature. All right, and here we are at our last little bit of information in our lecture, our 4 writers. There are other writers that are just as important probably during this time period, but for our purposes, we're going to look at these 4. William Bradford, Anne Bradstreet, Edward Taylor, whom I sometimes refer to as E.T., and Jonathan Edwards. I say E.T. because it's easy to mix up Edward Taylor and Jonathan Edwards. So if you think Edward Taylor, E.T., it's a little bit easier to keep them straight. So the 4 authors of our time period, William Bradford, Anne Bradstreet, Edward Taylor, and Jonathan Edwards. You will be expected to know a little bit about each of these 4 people as well as their works. Okay, and here's my credit slide for the artwork that I used throughout my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me through email or through your teacher if I'm not the one teaching your class. Please return to Blackboard at this point and complete your next assignment. Thank you.